Good evening. It's a magical day on a Sunday. Lovely to have you folks here. And can't wait to read some stories for you. Gonna wait just a moment to see if a couple more folks will join, but I'm excited you're all here. And here's hoping you enjoy the stories. I got another selection for this week. And I've also tweaked a few of the stream settings that I hope will make it a little less frustrating to try and chat. There's 8 million settings to protect the channel, and I appreciate those. It's nice to have them, but at the same time I didn't realize they were on, so it made it, you have to be verified, you have to have a note from your mom, you got to have 15 layers of identification, so those have been backed off a bit. A little excessive for story time. But here's hoping that we can have a good night. And just checking one or two more things, and then we'll be off to Storyland. Okay. One quick little thing. I got a card in the mail, and it's pretty darn good. See if we can get this. And yeah. A truly wonderful St. Patrick's Day card from a certain special someone. Always the classiest. Alrighty, we're gonna take a little trip through our garden path. And it's time for our campfire setting. And tonight we're going to start out with this guy. You know it's a good one. It's when it's a Reader's Digest compilation. And the story, our first story for tonight, is The Three Little Pigs. I did a little bit of looking around to get some background on this story, and unfortunately there wasn't a whole lot. I should go to an actual library where they probably have books about this, but good old Wikipedia tells me that the first printed version of this story is from the 1840s, and the general story is probably much older. They had a kind of different mix of characters early on, and then the one that we're most familiar with, published by Joseph Jacobs in 1890. And he credits a James Hallowell Phillips as the source. You may have heard of Grimm's fairy tales. The brothers Grimm were interesting fellows. They did a lot of research on folk tales and stories, fables, all that kind of stuff. And, they meet people and go write them down. And so many of these stories were passed down in the family. You have a lot of long nights, and you you don't have TV or internet, so you tell stories. And these would then get passed around from the different families, and so some of them had been told, and if you got a good storyteller, sometimes they get shared around, and so people would meet up and they'd have storytelling contests, or just, informal being around campfires, which is why I've got my little campfire set. It's a natural setting for telling stories, but these come to us, and they have a long chain stretching back to the earliest days of people. Ever since there have been people, there have been stories, and they're a lot of fun. So here we go for our first story of the night with the Three Little Pigs. There was an old sow with 3 little pigs, and as she had not enough to keep them, she sent them out into the world to seek their fortune. The first that went off met a man with a bundle of straw, and said to him, "Please, man, give me the straw to build a house," which the man did, and the little pig built a house with it. Presently along came a wolf, who knocked at the door and said, little pig, let me come in." To which the pig answered, "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." The wolf answered to that, "Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." So he huffed and he puffed, and he blew the house in, and ate up the little pig. The second little pig met a man with a bundle of twigs, and said, "Please, man, give me those twigs to build a house," which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll puff and I'll huff, and I'll blow your house in." So he huffed and he puffed, and he puffed and he huffed, and at last he blew the house down, and he ate up the little pig. The third little pig met a man with a load of bricks, and said, "Please, man, give me those bricks to build a house with." The man gave him the bricks, and he built his house with them. So the wolf came, and as he did to the other little pigs, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." Well, he huffed and he puffed and he huffed and he puffed and he puffed, but he could not get the house down. When he found that he could not, with all his huffing and puffing, blow it down, he said, little pig, I know where there is a nice patch of turnips." "Where?" said the little pig. "In Mr. Smith's home field, and if you will be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you, and we will go together and get some for dinner." "Very well," said the little pig. "I will be ready. What time do you mean to go?" "Oh, at 6 o'clock. Well, the little pig woke up at 5 and got the turnips before the wolf came, which he did about 6, and said, little pig, are you ready?" The little pig said, "Ready? I have been and come back again, and got a nice potful for dinner." The wolf felt very angry at this, but thought that he would catch the little pig somehow or other, so he said, "Little pig, I know where there is a nice apple tree." "Where?" said the pig. "Down in the big park," replied the wolf. "And if you will not deceive me, I will come for you at 5 o'clock tomorrow, and we will get some apples." Well, the little pig bustled out the next morning at 4 o'clock, and went off for the apples, hoping to get back before the wolf came. But he had farther to go, and had to climb the tree, so that just as he was climbing down from it, he saw the wolf coming, which, as you may suppose, frightened him very much. When the wolf came up, he said, "What, little pig? Are you here before me? Are they nice apples?" "Oh, yes, very," said the little pig. "I will throw you down one." And he threw it so far that, while the wolf had gone to pick it up, the little pig jumped down and ran all the way home. The next day, the wolf came again and said to the little pig, "Little pig, there is a fair in town this afternoon. Will you go?" "Oh, yes," said the pig, "I will go. What time shall you be ready?" "At 3, said the wolf. The little pig went off before the time, as usual, and arrived at the fair. He bought a butter churn, which he was going home with when he saw the wolf coming. Then he could not tell what to do. He got into the churn to hide, and by so doing turned it around, and it rolled down the hill with the pig in it, which frightened the wolf so much that he ran home without going to the fair. He went to the little pig's house and told him how frightened he had been by a great round thing which came down the hill past him. Then the little pig said, "Ha! I frightened you, did I? I had been to the fair and bought myself a butter churn, and when I saw you, I got into it and rolled down the hill." Then the wolf was very angry indeed, and declared that he would eat up the little pig, and he would come down the chimney after him. When the little pig saw what he was about, he hung up a pot full of water and made a blazing fire, and just as the wolf was coming down, took off the cover of the pot, and in fell the wolf. So the little wolf put on the cover again in an instant, boiled the wolf up, and ate him for supper, and lived happily ever after. And that's the story of the 3 little pigs. Now, can anyone tell me the moral of the story of the 3 little pigs? Anyone? That's right. Always have onions and carrots on hand in case you happen to catch a wolf in your soup pot. It's that kind of wisdom passed down from the ages that is so important to teach the new generations. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in. I hope you're all having a wonderful Sunday afternoon. Yes, during lunch meat, he ate the wolf. Pigs are technically omnivores, so there is some basis for that. But it's one of the wonderful things about the old fairy tales is the further you go back into the past, typically the more bloodthirsty they are. They've been sanitized. They've been reconstituted. They've been made very, very cute and cuddly for the modern age. And by modern age, I mean from the 1900s onward. There's been a lot of modifications to them. But thankfully, there's researchers that have the older stories, and so every so often you can find those. And often you go, "Oh, well, isn't that horrible?" You know what? Yeah, we're going to have, a cutesy little tale, and you have a nice little moral, and it's not quite so awful. So, welcome to Storyland. So that was our first story for the night. Next story is from the Encyclopedia Brown book series by Donald J. Sobol. And tonight we have The Case of the Marble Shooter. This book was first published in 1967, by the way. Now it happens that in America, some people break the law. Many get caught, but a few get away. This was not true in Idaville. In Idaville, everyone who broke the law got caught. Aside from catching crooks 1, 2, 3, Idaville was like any other American town its size. It had banks, movie theaters, and delicatessens. It had rich families, poor families, and several miles of sunny beach. And for its war on crime, Idaville had Encyclopedia Brown. Encyclopedia's father was Chief Brown, head of the Idaville police force. People from everywhere agreed that he was the smartest police officer in the land. Chief Brown never let out the reason for his success. If he did, who would believe him? Who would believe that the real brains behind Idaville's wonderful police record was his quiet 10-year-old son? For a year now, Chief Brown had been bringing home his hardest cases. Encyclopedia solved them while eating dinner in the Browns' red brick house on Rover Avenue. Since Encyclopedia had taken to matching wits with criminals, the word had raced through the underworld, "Stay clear of Idaville." Idaville! Big-time gunmen trembled at the mere mention of the town. Encyclopedia never told anyone about the help he gave his father. He didn't want to seem different from other fifth graders. But he could do nothing about his nickname. Only his parents and teachers called him by his right name, Leroy. Everyone else in Idaville called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or set of books filled with facts from A to Z. Encyclopedia Brown knew about the American Automobile Association, the Zanzibar Zipper Company, and everything in between. He had read more books than Miss Babcock, the principal of the Idaville Grammar School. Encyclopedia did not solve mysteries just in the dining room. During the summer, he often solved them in the garage. He wanted to help the children of the neighborhood, so he had opened his own detective business. Outside the garage each morning, he hung a sign. Brown Detective Agency, 13 Rover Avenue, Leroy Brown, President. No case too small, 25 cents per day, plus expenses. One day, a boy walked into the garage. He dropped to one knee before Idaville's only private detective. Goodness, thought Encyclopedia. I haven't been that successful. The boy wasn't doing homage, however. He was aiming. With a snap of his thumb, he spun a quarter through the air. It landed on the gasoline can beside Encyclopedia. "You've got a hot thumb," said Encyclopedia. "You've got the hottest thumb I've ever seen." "I want to hire you," said the boy. "My name is Algernon Keogh. Some big kid just made off with Minnie and Moocher." "Kidnap them?" exclaimed Encyclopedia. "Didn't they shout for help?" "No, but they clinked a little," said Algernon glumly. Encyclopedia couldn't imagine why two girls should dress in anything that clinked, like two knights or a pair of dice. It's months too early for Halloween, he thought. The case was a puzzler, all right. "Describe the missing persons, please," he said. "Minnie has 2 red stripes across the middle," began Algernon. "Moocher has... Wait! They're not missing persons. They're missing marbles." Algernon explained. Minnie and Moocher were his best shooters. He had been practicing marbles by himself when a big kid had come along and challenged him to a match. "For fair or for keeps?" asked Encyclopedia. "For keeps," answered Algernon. "He beat you?" "I beat him," said Algernon. "I won all his marbles. He got sore and took Minnie and Moocher and all my other marbles." "You didn't try to stop him?" "Of course I tried," said Algernon. "I said I'd tweak him, but a bunch of his friends appeared. They asked who I was, and the big kid said, 'Who? I don't see anyone.' But I noticed he closed his eyes just before he spoke." Said Encyclopedia. "How was he dressed?" "He wore a sweatshirt with tigers written on it, like his friends." "I knew it!" exclaimed Encyclopedia. "Bugs Meany!" Bugs Meany was the leader of the Tigers, a gang of tough older boys. When it came to upsetting the peace of the neighborhood, they were worse than noisy plumbing. Since opening his detective agency, Encyclopedia had often been hired to stop Bugs's dishonest doings. For several minutes, Encyclopedia was silent, thinking. Algernon stood by, working his thumb to develop muscle. Finally, Encyclopedia said, "Bugs will say he never saw you before. We must make him admit he knows you." "He knows me," said Algernon. "He called me Algernon, an old pal when we started to shoot marbles. After I licked him, he called me a dirty thief and lots of other names." "We had better talk with Bugs," said Encyclopedia. "Let's go, Algernon." "Just call me Al if you don't mind. Algernon means with the mustache." The Tiger's clubhouse was in a used tool shed behind Mr. Sweeney's auto body shop. When Encyclopedia and Algernon arrived, Bugs was alone. He was playing checkers with himself and cheating. "Scram!" he snarled when he saw Encyclopedia, "or I'll knock you so hard on the head you'll have to take off your shoes to watch television." "I ought to tweak him now while he's alone," whispered Al. "Take it easy," Encyclopedia whispered back. But Algernon began working his thumb excitedly. Bugs Meany stared. "What's with this kid?" he asked. "Is he practicing to be a hitchhiker?" "His name is Al Kehoe, and you stole Minnie and Moocher and his other marbles," said Encyclopedia. "Kindly return them." "I stole his marbles?" cried Bugs. He clapped himself smartly on the forehead. "Why, I never saw Jumpy Thumb here before in my life." Algernon's marble-shooting thumb was wiggling faster than ever. "I was a coward to let him rob me," he muttered. He started for Bugs. Encyclopedia pushed him back. "I'm gonna tweak him, so help me," said Algernon. Just then, Duke Kelly and Spike Larson, two tigers, entered the clubhouse. They glared at Encyclopedia. Then they saw Algernon's thumb wiggling. "Who is he?" they asked. "Algernon Kehoe," answered Bugs. "He says I stole his marbles." "I ought to tweak them all," Algernon growled under his breath. "Tweak, tweak, tweak." "What's he mumbling about?" demanded Bugs. "I beat you at marbles, and I can beat you at tweak," said Algernon. "Tweak?" said Bugs. "Tweak," repeated Algernon. "It's played like this." His right hand, with his powerful thumb tucked under his forefinger, shot out. When his hand got under Bugs' lower lip, his thumb snapped free like a broken spring. "Tweak!" said Algernon. Boing, boing, went Bugs's lips. They bounced up and down like the tip of a diving board. While Bugs was danced around flapping his arms in pain, Spike and Duke cocked their fists. Encyclopedia held up his hands. "Don't make more trouble for yourselves," he warned. "Bugs stole Algernon's marbles, all right." What made Encyclopedia so sure? Turn to page 71 for the solution to the case of the marble shooter. And so we're flipping pages. Got to go to the solution. But I wonder if any of you spotted the critical clue that has given Encyclopedia Brown all the ammunition he needs to solve the case. And so, here on page 71, we have the solution to the case of the marble shooter. Bugs Meany said he had never seen the marble shooter before in my life. Yet when Duke Kelly and Spike Larson asked who he was, Bugs said he was Algernon Kehoe. That was Bugs's slip. For when Encyclopedia spoke with Bugs in the clubhouse, he called the marble shooter Al Kehoe. Al is short for many names. A few are Albert, Aldrich, Alfonso, Alfred, Alistair, Alton, and Alvin. Bugs could not have known, unless he had met Algernon before, that Al was short for Algernon. The end. So you got to watch it. Marbles are serious business. And I seriously doubt anybody's actually played marbles here in the last 50 years or so. But Yeah, that was serious doings. You like they said, you can play for fair or play for keeps. So you can have a little competition where you use the big heavy marbles to knock other marbles out of a little circle, and if you knocked a bunch of them out, you got to keep them. So playing for keeps, or it's just competition, and pretty much you have to memorize what your marbles look like. So you want to be, you know that you had stripes on them or cat's eyes or all kinds of things, and there were shooters, and I've seen steel marbles, basically big ball bearings, and those are heavy duty. Marble. The other funny part is, you it looks a lot like curling, and there's other sports that, all kind of the same thing. You have these targets, and then you use your puck or your marble to knock the other person's marbles out of the circle that you draw. So there's a whole lot of games in that kind of genre. But yeah, marbles was big deal back in the day. Well before my time. And with all the video games that I've ever seen, that now that I think about it, maybe there's some point and click adventure that has it, but I don't think I've ever seen like, welcome to Marbles 3D in Unreal 5. We're gonna ultimate simulate marble competition. Hi, Mary. And Rabbit and Mabel and Daring Lunch Meat and Brittany and Sam and all kinds of folks. Everybody, Bio. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate you coming by for story time. So, ooh, we got a marble maven here. All right, we have our next book is another series, Homer Price, by Robert McCloskey, and this one was first published in 1943. So we're going back a bit, and let me get to the start, and we're here we are with the case of the sensational scent. About 2 miles outside of Centerburg, where Route 56 meets Route 56A, there lives a boy named Homer. Homer's father owns a tourist camp. Homer's mother cooks fried chicken and hamburgers in the lunchroom and takes care of the tourist cabins, while his father takes care of the filling station. Homer does odd jobs about the place. Sometimes he washes windshields of cars to help his father, and sometimes he sweeps out cabins or takes care of the lunchroom to help his mother. When Homer isn't going to school or doing odd jobs or playing with other boys, he works on his hobby, which is building radios. He has a workshop in one corner of his room where he works in the evenings. Before going to bed at night, he usually goes down to the kitchen to have a glass of milk and cookies because working on radios makes him hungry. Tabby, the family cat, usually comes around for something to eat, too. One night, Homer came down and opened the icebox door and poured a saucer of milk for Tabby and a glass of milk for himself. He put the bottle back and looked to see if there was anything interesting on the other shelves. He heard footsteps and felt something soft brush his leg, so he reached down to pet Tabby. When he looked down, the animal drinking the milk certainly wasn't a cat. It was a skunk. Homer was startled just a little, but he didn't make any sudden motions because he remembered what he had read about skunks. They can make a very strong smell that people and other animals don't like. But the smell is only for protection, and if you don't frighten them or hurt them, they're very friendly. That's why they're called stinky kitties. While the skunk finished drinking the saucer of milk, Homer decided to keep it for a pet because he had read somewhere that skunks become excellent pets if you treat them kindly. He decided to name the skunk Aroma. Then he poured out some more milk for Aroma, and he had some more himself. Aroma finished the second saucer of milk, licked his mouth, and calmly started to walk away. Homer followed and found that Aroma's home was under the house, right beneath his window. During the next few days, Homer did a lot of thinking about what would be the best way to tame Aroma. He didn't know what his mother would think of a pet skunk around the house, but he said to himself Aroma had been living under the house all this time, and nobody knew about it, so I guess it will be all right for it to keep on being a secret. He took a saucer of milk out to Aroma every evening when nobody was looking, and in a few weeks Aroma was just as tame as a puppy. Homer thought it would be nice if he could bring Aroma up to his room, because it would be good to have company while he worked building radios. So he got an old basket and tied a rope to the handle to make an elevator. He let the basket down from his window and trained Aroma to climb in when he gave a low whistle. Then he would pull the rope, and up came the basket, and up came Aroma to pay a social call. Aroma spent most of his visit sleeping, while Homer worked on a new radio. Aroma's favorite place to sleep was in Homer's suitcase. One evening, Homer said, "There, that's the last wire soldered, and my new radio is finished. I'll put the new tubes in it, then we can try it out." Aroma opened one eye and didn't look interested, even when the radio worked perfectly and an announcer's voice said, "N.W. Blott of Centerburg won the grand prize of $2,000 for writing the best slogan about Dregs after-shaving lotion." "Why, I know him, and he's from my town," said Homer. Aroma still looked uninterested, while the announcer said that next week they would broadcast the Dregs program from Centerburg, and that Mr. Dregs himself would give Mr. N.W. Blott the $2,000 cash and 12 bottles of Dregs lotion for thinking up the best advertising slogan. "Just think, Aroma, a real radio broadcast from Centerburg. I'll have to see that." The day of the broadcast arrived, and Homer rode to Centerburg on his bicycle to watch. He was there early, and he got a good place right next to the man who worked the controls, so he could see everything that happened. Mr. Dregs made a speech about the wonderful thing Mr. N.W. Blott had contributed to the future of American shaving with his winning slogan, "The aftershave lotion with the distinctive, invigorating smell that keeps you on your toes." Then he gave N.W. the 2,001 bottles of lotion in a suitcase, just like the one that Homer had at home. After N.W. made a short speech, the program was over. Just then, 4 men said, "Put 'em up," and then one of them said to N.W., "If you please," and grabbed a suitcase with all the money and lotion inside of it. Everyone was surprised. Mr. Dregs was surprised. N.W. Blott was surprised. The announcer was surprised. The radio control man was surprised. And everybody was frightened, too. The robbers were gone before anybody knew what happened. They jumped into a car and were out of sight down Route 56A before the sheriff shouted, "Wait till I send out an alarm, men, then we'll chase them. No radio robbers can do that in this town and get away again." The sheriff sent out an alarm to the state police, and then some of the men took their shotguns and went off down 56A in the sheriff's car. Homer waited around until the sheriff and the men came back, and the sheriff said, "They got clean away. There's not hide or hair of them in the whole length of 56 or 56A. While they were eating dinner that evening, Homer told the family about what happened in town. After helping with the dishes, he went up to his room, and after he had pulled Aroma up in the basket, he listened to the news report of the robbery on his new radio. "The police are baffled," the news commentator said. Mr. N.W. Blott is offering half of the prize money and 6 bottles of the lotion to anyone who helps him get his prize back. Aroma, if we could just catch those robbers, we would have enough money to build lots of radios, and even a television receiver, said Homer. He decided that he had better go to bed instead of trying to think of a way to catch robbers, because he was going to get up very early in the next morning and go fishing. He woke up before it was light, slipped on his pants, and ate a bowl of cereal. Then he found his fishing pole, gave a low whistle for Aroma. The whistle wasn't necessary because Aroma was waiting in the basket. Homer put the basket on his bike, and they rode off down 56A. They turned into the woods where the bridge crossed the brook, and Homer parked the bike and started to walk along the brook, with Aroma following right along. They fished all morning, but didn't catch anything because the fish just weren't biting. They tried all the best places in the brook, and when they were ready to go home, they decided to go straight through the woods instead of following the brook, because the woods path was much shorter. The path through the woods was an old wood road that was not used anymore. It had not been used for years, and almost everybody had forgotten that it was ever built. Before they had gone very far, Homer thought he heard voices. Then he smelled bacon cooking. He thought it was strange because nobody ever came up this mountain to camp, so he decided to sneak up and investigate. When Homer and Aroma looked around a large rock, they saw 4 men. "The robbers!" whispered Homer, and indeed they were the robbers. There was the suitcase with the $2,000, and the 12 bottles of shaving lotion lying open on the ground. The robbers had evidently just gotten up, because they were cooking breakfast over an open fire, and their faces were covered with soapy lather, for they were shaving. Homer was so interested in what the robbers were doing that he forgot to keep an eye on Aroma. The next thing he knew, Aroma had left the hiding place and was walking straight toward the suitcase. He climbed inside and curled up on the packages of money and went right to sleep. The robbers were busy shaving and having a difficult time of it, too, because they had only one little mirror, and they were all stooped over trying to look in it. "I can hardly wait to finish shaving and try some of that fragrant after-shaving lotion," said the first robber. Then the second robber, who had a cramp in his back from stooping over and from sleeping in the woods, straightened up and turned around. He noticed Aroma and said, "Look at that thing in our money!" The other robbers turned around and looked surprised. "That, my dear friend, is not a thing. It is a mustaling mammal, genus Mephitis, commonly known as a skunk," said the third robber, who had evidently gone to college and studied zoology. "Well, I don't care if it's a thing or a mammal or a skunk. You can't sleep on my money. I'll cook that mammal's goose." And he picked up a big gun and pointed it at Aroma. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," said the third robber with the college education. "It might attract the sheriff, and besides, it isn't the accepted thing to do to mustelin mammals." So the robbers put a piece of bacon on the end of a stick and tried to coax Aroma out of the suitcase. But Aroma just sniffed at the bacon, yawned, and went back to sleep. Now the fourth robber picked up a rock and said, "This will scare it away." The rock went sailing through the air and landed with an alarming crash. It missed Aroma, but it broke a 6 bottles of Mr. Dregg's lotion. The air was filled with that distinctive, invigorating smell that keeps you on your toes. But mostly, the air was filled with Aroma. Everybody ran because the smell was so strong it made you want to close your eyes. Homer waited by the old oak tree for Aroma to catch up, but not for Aroma to catch up all the way. They came to the bike and rode off at full speed, except to stop once to put Aroma and the basket on the rear mudguard. They made the trip home in record time. Homer was very thoughtful while he did the odd jobs that afternoon. He thought he had better tell his mother what had happened up on the mountain. His father had gone into the city to buy some things that were needed around the place, and he would not be back until later that night. At dinner time, he was just about to tell her when she said, "I think I smell a skunk around here. I'll tell your father when he gets home. We will have to get rid of that animal right away, because people will not want to spend the night at our tourist camp if we have that smell around." Then Homer decided not to say anything about it, because he didn't want his father to get rid of Aroma, and because the robbers would no doubt get caught by the state police anyway. That evening, Homer was taking care of the gas station and helping his mother while his father was in the city. In between cooking hamburgers and putting gas in cars, he read the Radio Builders magazine and looked at the pictures in the mail-order catalog. About 8 o'clock, 4 men got out of a car and said, "We would like to rent a tourist cabin for the night." Homer said, "All right, follow me," and he led the way to one of the largest cabins. "I think you'll be comfortable here," he said, "and that will be $4 in advance, please." "Here's a $5 bill, buddy. You can keep the change," said one of the men. "Thanks," said Homer, as he stuffed the bill in his pocket and hurried out the door because there was a car outside honking for gas. He was just about to put the $5 bill in the cash register when he smelled that strange mixture, partly the distinctive invigorating smell that keeps you on your toes, and partly aroma. He sniffed the bill, and sure enough, that was what he had smelled. "The robbers! Those 4 men are the robbers," said Homer to himself. He decided that he had better call up the sheriff and tell him everything. He knew that the sheriff would be down at the barber shop in Centerburg playing checkers and talking politics with his friends, this being Saturday night. He waited until his mother was busy getting an extra blanket for someone because he did not think it was necessary to frighten her. Then he called the barber shop and asked to talk to the sheriff. "Hello," said Homer to the sheriff. "Those 4 robbers are spending the night out here at our tourist camp. Why don't you come out and arrest them?" "Well, I'll be switched," said the sheriff. "Have they got the money and the lotion with them?" "Yes, they brought it," said Homer. "Well, have they got their guns along too?" asked the sheriff. "I don't know, but if you hold the line a minute, I'll slip out and look," said Homer. He slipped out and peeped through the window of the robbers' cabin. They were getting undressed, and their guns were lying on the table, and on the chairs, and under the bed, and on the dresser. There were lots of guns. Homer slipped back and told the sheriff, "They must have a dozen or 2. The sheriff said, "They have, huh? Well, I'll tell you, Sonny, I'm just about to get my hair cut, so you just sort of keep your eye on them, and I'll be out there in an hour or so. That'll give them some time to get to sleep, and some of my boys and me can walk right in and snap the bracelets on them." "Okay, see you later, Sheriff," said Homer. Later, when his mother came in, Homer said, "Mother, I have some very important business. Do you think that you could take care of things for a while?" "Well, I think so, Homer," said his mother, "but don't stay away too long." Homer slipped up to the window in the robber's cabin and started keeping an eye on them. They were just getting into bed, and they were not in a very good humor, because they had been arguing about how to divide the money and the 6 bottles of lotion that were left. They were afraid, too, that one of the 4 might get up in the night and run away with the suitcase with the money and the lotion in it. They finally decided to sleep all 4 in one bed, because if one of them got out of bed, it would surely wake the others up. It was a tight fit, but they all managed to get into bed and get themselves covered up. They put the suitcase with the money and the lotion inside right in the middle of the bed. After they had turned out the light, it was very quiet for a long while. Then the first robber said, "You know, this ain't so comfortable, sleeping 4 in a bed." "I know," the second robber said, "but it's better than sleeping in the woods where there are mosquitoes and funny little animals that don't smell so nice. added the third robber. You must admit, though, that our present condition could be described as being a trifle overcrowded, said the one with the college education. Them's my feelings exactly, said the first robber. We might as well start driving to Mexico, because we can't sleep like this. We might as well ride toward the border. No, driving at night makes me nervous, said the second robber. Me too, said the third. Then there followed a long argument, with the first and third robbers trying to convince the second and fourth robbers that they should go to Mexico right away. While they were arguing, Homer thought very hard. He guessed that something had better be done pretty quick, or the robbers might decide to go before the sheriff got his hair cut. He thought of a plan, and without making a sound he slipped away from the window and hurried to Aroma's hole under the house. He whistled softly, and Aroma came out and climbed into the basket. Aroma had calmed down considerably, but she still smelled pretty strong. Homer quietly carried the basket to the spot under the robber's window and listened. They were still arguing about the trip to Mexico. They didn't notice Homer as he put the basket through the window onto the chair beside the bed. Of course, Aroma immediately crawled out on the bed and took her place on the suitcase. "Stop tickling," said the tall robber, because his feet stuck out, and Aroma's tail was resting on his toes. "I'm not tickling you," said the second robber. "But say, I think I still smell that animal." "Now that you mention it, I seem to smell it too," said the third robber. The fourth robber reached for the light button, saying, "That settles it. Let's get dressed and go to Mexico, because I think I smell that animal too." Then, as the robber turned on the light, Homer shouted, "You do smell that animal, and please don't make any sudden moves, because he excites easily." The robbers took one look and pulled the covers over their heads. "The sheriff will be here in a few minutes," said Homer bravely. But 5 minutes later, the sheriff had not shown up. The robbers were getting restless, and Aroma was tapping her foot and getting excited. Homer began to be disturbed about what his mother would say if Aroma smelled up one of her largest and best tourist cabins, so he quickly thought of a plan. He climbed through the window. He gathered up all the guns and put them in the basket. Then he gathered up the robbers' clothes and tossed them out the window. After picking out one of the larger guns, Homer waved it in the direction of the robbers and said, "You may come out from under the covers now and hold up your hands." The robbers gingerly lifted the covers and peeked out. Then they climbed carefully out of bed so as not to disturb Aroma and put up their hands. "We didn't mean to do it," mumbled the first robber. "And we'll give the money back," said the second robber. "Our environment is responsible for our actions," said the educated robber. "I'm sorry," Homer said, "but I'll have to take you to the sheriff." He motioned with the gun and demanded that the fourth robber pick up the suitcase with the prize money and lotion inside. Then he said, "Forward, march!" "Must we go in our pajamas?" cried one. "And without our shoes?" wailed another. "Aroma is getting excited," Homer reminded them, and the robbers started marching without any more arguing. But they did grumble and groan about walking on gravel with bare feet. Robbers aren't accustomed to going without shoes, and they couldn't have run away, even if Homer and Aroma hadn't been there to guard them. First came the robber with his hands up, then the second robber with his hands up, then the third robber with his hands up, and then the fourth robber with his right hand up and his left hand down, carrying the suitcase. Of course, Aroma followed the suitcase. And last of all came Homer, carrying the basket with a dozen or two guns in it. He marched them straight down Route 56A and up the main street of Centerburg. They turned into the barber shop where the sheriff was getting his hair cut, and the boys were sitting around playing checkers. When the sheriff saw them come in the door, he stopped talking about the World Series and said, "We'll all be switched if it ain't the radio robbers." The sheriff got out of the barber chair with his hair cut up one side and not cut up the other, and put handcuffs on the men, and led them off to the jail. Well, there isn't much more to tell. The newspaper told the story and had headlines saying, "Boy and pet skunk trap shaving lotion robbers by smell." And the news commentators on the radio told about it too. Homer's father and mother said that Homer could keep Aroma for a pet because instead of hurting business, Aroma had doubled business. People from miles around are coming to the crossroad where 56 meets 56A just to buy gasoline and eat a hamburger or a home-cooked dinner and to see Aroma. The next time Homer went into Centerburg to get a haircut, he talked the whole thing over with the sheriff. "Yep," said the sheriff, "that was sure one swell job of smelling. The end. And that was the first story from the Homer Price series. And he's kind of right. The skunks are generally pretty reasonably docile. If they get startled, if they get toyed with, if a bad wind happens, then they kind of do a little dance, although they don't have to. But they can become very, very unhappy, and they let you know, and they let the rest of the world know about their happiness. I own these books. These are from my personal library. I have collected a bunch of stuff over the years, and stuff that I was given as a kid, and I've held on to books for a long, long time. So it's kind of fun to go back into this particular shelf and see the stuff that's there. My dad is a avid reader, and mom and sister, everybody in my family reads. So we've got lots and lots of books, and but yeah, good question. Just the Encyclopedia Brown I used to check out from our local lending library, and so I read through a bunch of those, and then at some point I actually worked at a used bookstore briefly, the volunteer gig where you get store credit for putting in go and reshelve books and sort things and organize, and the store credit is incredibly valuable because then you get more books, which is always the always the goal. Get more books. Oh, do you have more books? No time to read them. It's time to get more books. Alrighty, well, we're got time for, I think, one more for the evening. And I really appreciate everybody coming by. And we have one more story from the Moomin series by Tove Jansson. And this is from the Tales from Moominvalley. It was first published in English in 1963. And in this story, it features a new character. It's called a Hemulen. And something notable about Hemulens is they all wear long night shirts and are usually focused on some kind of hobby like stamp collecting or butterfly collecting. And those particular Hemulens are in a separate book in the Moomin series, The Comet in Moominland. Thank you, Bio. And for tonight, we have the story, The Hemulen Who Loved Silence. Once upon a time, there was a Hemulen who worked in a pleasure ground. That'd be a little carnival, which doesn't necessarily mean having a lot of fun. The Hemulen's job was to punch holes in tickets so that people wouldn't have fun more than once. And such a job is quite enough to make anyone sad if you have to do it all your life. The Hemulen punched and punched, and while punching, he used to dream of the things he would do when he got his pension at last. In case someone doesn't know what a pension is, it means that you can do what you like in all the peace you wish for, when you're old enough. At least, that was how the Hemulen's relatives had explained it to him. He had terribly many relatives, a great lot of enormous, rollicking, talkative Hemulens, who went about slapping each other's backs and bursting into gigantic laughs. They were joint owners of the pleasure ground, and in their spare time they blew the trombone or threw the hammer, told funny stories, and frightened people generally, but they did it all with that best of intentions. The Hemulen himself didn't own anything because he was on the sideline, which means only half a relative, and as he never could put his foot down about anything to anyone, he always had to do the babysitting, to work the big bellows of the merry-go-round, and most of the time to punch tickets. "You're lonely and have nothing to do," the other Hemulens used to tell him in their friendly way, "so it might cheer you up a bit to lend a hand and be among people." "But I'm never lonely," the Hemulen tried to explain. "I can't find the time to be. There's always such a lot of people who want to cheer me up. If you don't mind, I'd like so much to—" "Splendid!" the relative said, and slapped his back. "That's the thing! Never lonely, always on the go!" The Hemulen punched away, dreaming about a great, wonderful, silent loneliness, and hoping he would grow old as soon as possible. The whirligigs whirled, the trombones trumpeted, gaffsies and wampers and mimbles shrieked on the roller coaster every night. Edward the Booble won a first prize in china smashing, and all around the sad and dreamy Hemulen people danced and whooped, laughed and quarreled, and they ate and drank. And by, the Hemulen grew simply afraid of noisy people who were enjoying themselves. He used to sleep in the Hemulen children's dormitory, which was bright and nice in the daytime, and at night, when the kiddies awoke and cried, he comforted them with a barrel organ. The rest of his spare time he lent a hand anywhere it was needed in a large house full of Hemulens, and so he had company around the clock, and everybody was in high spirits and told him all about everything they thought and did and planned to do, only they never gave him time to reply properly. "Won't I grow old soon?" the Hemulen once asked at dinner. "Old? You?" his uncle shouted. "Far from it! Buck up, buck up! Nobody's older than he feels." "But I feel really old," the Hemulen said hopefully. "Pish-posh!" the uncle said. "We're going to have an extra spot of fireworks tonight, and the brass band will play until sunrise." But the fireworks were never touched off, because the same afternoon a great rain started to fall. It continued all night and all the next day, and the next one after that, and then all the following week. To tell the truth, this rain kept up for 8 weeks without a stop. No one had ever seen the like. The pleasure ground lost its colors, shrank, and withered away like a flower. It palled and rusted, and then slowly started to disperse, because it was built on sand. The roller coaster railway caved in with a sigh, and the merry-go-rounds went slowly turning around in large gray pools and puddles until they were swept off, faintly tinkling, by the new rivers that were formed by the rain. All small kiddies, toffles and woodies and wampers and mimbles, and so forth, were standing days on end with their noses pressed to the window panes, looking at their July becoming drenched, and their color and music floating away. The house of mirrors came crashing down in millions of wet splinters, and drenched pink paper roses from the miracle garden went bobbing off in hundreds over the field. Over it all rose the wailing chorus of the kiddies. They were driving their parents to desperation, because they hadn't a single thing to do except grieve over the lost pleasure ground. Streamers and empty balloons were drooping from the trees. The happy house was filled with mud, and the 3-headed alligator swam off to the sea. He left 2 of his heads behind him because they had been glued on. The Hemulens took it all as a splendid joke. They stood at their windows, laughing and pointing and slapping backs, and shouted, "Look! There goes the curtain to the Arabian Nights! The dancing floor has come loose! There's 5 black bats from the Cave of Horror on the Fillyjonks roof! Did you ever?" They decided in the best of spirits to start a skating rink instead, when the water froze, of course, and they tried to comfort the Hemulen by promising him the ticket-punching job again as soon as they could get things going. "No," the Hemulen suddenly said. "No, no, no! I don't want to. I want my pension. I want to do what I feel like doing, and I want to be absolutely alone in some silent place." "But, my dear nephew," one of his uncles said, with enormous astonishment, "do you mean what you say?" "I do," said the Hemulen. "Every word of it." "But why haven't you told us before?" the perplexed relatives asked him. "We've always believed that you've enjoyed yourself." "I never dared tell you," the Hemulen admitted. At this, they all laughed again and thought it terribly funny that the Hemulen had had to do things he disliked all his life only because he hadn't been able to put his foot down. "Well now, what do you want to do?" his maternal aunt asked cheerfully. "I'd like to build myself a doll's house," the Hemulen whispered. "The most beautiful doll's house in the world, with lots and lots of rooms, and all of them silent and solemn and empty." Now the Hemulens laughed so hard that they had to sit down. They gave each other enormous nudges and shouted, "A doll's house! Did you hear that? He said a doll's house!" And then they laughed themselves into tears and told him, "Little dear, by all means do exactly as you like. You can have Grandma's big park. Very probably it's silent as the grave nowadays. That's the very place for you to rummage about in and play to your heart's content. Good luck to you, and we hope you like it." "Thanks," the Hemulen said, feeling a little shrunken inwardly. "I know you've always wished me well." His dream about the doll's house with the calm and beautiful rooms vanished. The Hemulens had laughed it to pieces. But it really was no fault of theirs. They would have felt sincerely sorry if anyone had told them that they had spoiled something for the Hemulen, and it's a risky thing to talk about one's most secret dreams a bit too early. The Hemulen went along to Grandma's old park that was now his own. He had the key in his pocket. The park had been closed and never used since Grandma had set fire to her house with fireworks and moved elsewhere with all her family. That was long ago, and the Hemulen was even a little uncertain about the way to the park. The wood had grown, and ways and paths were under water. While he was splashing along, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had started 8 weeks before. But the Hemulen didn't notice it. He was wholly occupied with grieving over his lost dream and with feeling sorry because he didn't want to build a doll's house anymore. Now he could see the park wall. A little of it had tumbled down, but it was still quite a high wall. The single gate was rusty and very hard to unlock. The Hemulen went in and locked the gate behind him. Suddenly, he forgot about the doll's house. It was the very first time in his life that he had opened a door of his own and shut it behind him. He was home. He didn't live in someone else's house. The rain clouds were slowly drifting away, and the sun came out. The wet park was steaming and glittering all around him. It was green and unworried. No one had cut or trimmed or swept it for a very long time. Trees were reaching branches down to the ground. Bushes were climbing the trees, and crisscrossing in the luscious grass tinkled the brooks that Grandma had led through the park in her time. They didn't take care of the watering any longer. They took care only of themselves. But many of the little bridges were still standing, even if the garden paths had disappeared. The Hemulen threw himself headlong into the green, friendly silence. He gambled in it, he wallowed in it, and he felt younger than he ever had before. "Oh, how wonderful to be old and pensioned at last," he thought. "How much I like my relatives! and now I needn't even think of them. He went wading through the long, sparkling grass. He threw his arms around the trees, and finally he went to sleep in the sunshine in a clearing in the middle of the park. It was the place where Grandma's house had been. Her great firework parties were finished long ago. Young trees were coming up all around him, and where Grandma's bedroom used to be grew an enormous rose bush with 1,000 red rose hips. Night fell, lots of large stars came out, and the Hemulen loved his park all the better. It was wide and mysterious. One could lose one's way in it and still be at home. He wandered about for hours. He found Grandma's old fruit orchard where apples and pears lay strewn in the grass, and for a moment he thought, "What a pity! I can't eat half of them. One ought to—" And then he forgot about the thought, enchanted by the loneliness of the silence. He was owner of the moonlight on the ground. He fell in love with the most beautiful of the trees. He made wreaths of leaves and strung them around his neck. During his first night, he hardly had the heart to sleep at all. In the morning, the Hemulen heard a tinkle from the old bell that still hung by the gate. He felt worried. Someone was outside and wanted to come in. Someone wanted something from him. Silently, he crept in under the bushes along the wall and waited without a word. The bell jangled again. The Hemulen craned his neck, and he saw a very small whomper waiting outside the gate. "Go away!" the Hemulen called anxiously. "This is private ground. I live here." "I know," the small whomper replied. "The Hemulen sent me here with some dinner for you." "Oh, I see. That was kind of them," the Hemulen replied more cheerfully. He unlocked the gate and took the basket from the whomper. Then he shut the gate again. The whomper remained where he was for a while, but didn't say anything. "And how are you getting on?" the Hemulen asked impatiently. He stood fidgeting and longed to be back in his park again. "Badly," the whomper replied honestly. "We're in a bad way, all of us. We who are small, we've got no pleasure ground any more. We're just grieving." "Oh," the Hemulen said, staring at his feet. He didn't want to be asked to think of dreary things, but he was so accustomed to listening that he couldn't go away either. "You must be grieving too," the whomper said with compassion. "You used to punch the tickets, but if one was very small and ragged and dirty, you punched alongside it, and we could use it 2 or 3 times. My eyesight wasn't so good," the Hemulen explained. "They're waiting for you at home, aren't they?" The whomper nodded, but stayed on. He came close to the gate and thrust his nose through it. "I must tell you," he whispered. "We've got a secret." The Hemulen made a gesture of fright because he disliked other people's secrets and confidences. But the whomper continued excitedly. "We've rescued nearly all of it. We keep it in the Fillyjonks barn. You can't believe how much we've worked, rescued and rescued. We stole out nights in the rain and pulled things out of the water and down from the trees and dried them and repaired them, and now it's nearly right." "What is?" asked the Hemulen. "The pleasure ground, of course," the whomper cried, "or as much of it as we could find. All the pieces that were left. Splendid, isn't it? We're going to ask the Hemulens to put it together again for us, and then you can come back and punch the tickets." "Oh," the Hemulen mumbled and put the basket on the ground. "Fine, isn't it? That made you blink," the whomper said, laughed, waved his hand, and was off. Next morning, the Hemulen was anxiously waiting by the gate, and when the whomper came with the dinner basket, he called at once. "Well, what did they say?" "They didn't want to," the whomper said dejectedly. "They want to run a skating rink instead, and most of us go to sleep in winter, and anyway, where'd we get skates from?" "Oh, that's too bad," the Hemulen said, feeling quite relieved. The whomper didn't reply. He was so disappointed. He just put down the basket and turned back. Poor children, the Hemulen thought for a moment. Well, well. And then he started to plan the leaf hut he was going to build on Grandma's ruins. The Hemulen worked at his building all day and enjoyed himself tremendously. He stopped only when it was too dark to see anything, and then he went to sleep, tired and contented, and slept late the next morning. When he went to the gate to fetch his food, the Whomper had been there already. On the basket lid he found a letter signed by several kitties. Dear Pleasure Puncher, the Hemulen read, you can have all of it because you are all right, and perhaps you will let us play with you sometime because we like you. The Hemulen didn't understand a word, but a horrible suspicion began burrowing in his stomach. Then he saw. Outside the gate, the kitties had heaped everything they had rescued from the pleasure ground. It was a lot. Most of it was broken and tattered and wrongly reassembled, and all of it looked strange. It was a lost and miscellaneous collection of boards, canvas, wire, paper, and rusty iron. It was looking sadly and unexpectedly at the Hemulen, and he looked back in a panic. Then he fled into his park and started on his leaf hut again. He worked and worked, but nothing went quite right. His thoughts were elsewhere, and suddenly the roof came down, and the hut itself laid flat on the ground. No, said the Hemulen. I don't want to. I've only just learned to say no. I'm pensioned. I do what I like, nothing else. He said these things several times over, more and more menacingly. Then he rose to his feet, walked through the park, unlocked the gate, and began to pull all the wretched junk and scrap inside. The kitties were sitting perched on the high wall around the Hemulen's park. They resembled gray sparrows, but were quite silent. At times someone whispered, What's he doing now? Hush, said another, he doesn't like to talk. The Hemulen had hung up some lanterns and paper roses in the trees and put all the broken and ragged parts out of sight. Now he was assembling something that had once been a merry-go-round. The parts did not fit together very well, and half of them seemed to be missing. It's no use, he shouted crossly. Can't you see? It's just a lot of scrap and nothing else. No, I won't have any help from you. A murmur of encouragement and sympathy was carried down from the wall, but not a word was heard. The Hemulen started to make the merry-go-round into a kind of house instead. He put the horses in the grass and the swans in the brook, turned the rest upside down, and worked with his hair on end. Doll's house, he thought bitterly. What it all comes to in the end is a lot of tinsel and gewgaws on a dust heap, and a noise and a racket, just as there have been all my life. Then he looked up and shouted, What are you staring at? Run along to the Hemulens and tell them I don't want any dinner tomorrow. Instead, they might send me nails and a hammer and candles and rope and some 2-inch battens, and they better be quick about it. The kitties laughed and ran off. Didn't we tell him? The Hemulens cried and slapped each other's backs. He has to have something to do. The poor little thing's longing for his pleasure ground. And they sent him twice what he had asked for, and furthermore, food for a week, and 10 yards of red velvet, gold and silver paper and rolls, and a barrel organ just in case. No, said the Hemulen, no music box, nothing that makes a noise. Of course not, the kitties said, and kept the barrel organ outside. The Hemulen worked, built, and constructed, and while building he began to like the job, rather against his will. High in the trees, thousands of mirror glass splinters glittered, swaying with the branches in the winds. In the tree-tops, the Hemulen made little benches and soft nests where people could sit and have a drink of juice without being observed or just sleep. And from the strong branches hung the swings. The roller coaster railway was difficult. It had to be only a third of its former size, because so many parts were missing. But the Hemulen comforted himself with the thought that no one could be frightened enough to scream on it now. And from the last stretch, one was dumped in the brook, which is great fun to most people. But still the railway was a bit too much for the Hemulen to struggle with single-handed. When he had got one side right, the other side fell down, and at last he shouted very crossly, "Lend me a hand, someone! I can't do 10 things at once all alone!" The kiddies jumped down from the wall and came running. After that they built it jointly, and the Hemulen sent them such lots of food that the kiddies were able to stay all day in the park. In the evening they went home, but by sunrise they stood waiting at the gate. One morning they had brought along the alligator on a string. "Are you sure it'll keep quiet?" the Hemulen asked suspiciously. "Quite sure," the Whomper replied. "He won't say a word. He's so quiet and friendly now that he's got rid of his other heads." One day, the Fillyjonk's son found a boa constrictor in the porcelain stove. As it behaved nicely, it was immediately brought along to Grandma's park. Everybody collected strange things for the Hemulen's pleasure ground, or simply sent him cakes, kettles, window curtains, toffee, or whatever. It became a fad to send along presents with the kiddies in the mornings, and the Hemulen accepted everything that didn't make a noise. But he let no one inside the wall except the kiddies. The park grew more and more fantastic. In the middle of it, the Hemulen lived in the merry-go-round house. It was gaudy and lopsided, resembling most of all a large paper bag for toffees that somebody had crumpled up and thrown away. Inside it grew the rose bush with all the red rose hips. And one beautiful, mild evening, it was definitely finished. And for one moment, the sadness of completion overtook the Hemulen. They had lighted the lanterns and stood looking at their work. Mirror, glass, and silver and gold gleamed in the great dark trees. Everything was ready and waiting. The ponds, the boats, the tunnels, the roller coaster, the juice stand, the swings, the dartboards, the trees for climbing, the apple boxes. "Here you are," the Hemulen said. "Just remember that this is not a pleasure ground. It's the Park of Silence." The kiddies silently threw themselves into the enchantment they had helped to build. But the Whomper turned and asked, "And you won't mind that you've no tickets to punch?" "No," said the Hemulen. "I'd punch the air in any case." He went into the merry-go-round and lighted the moon from the miracle garden. Then he stretched himself out in the Fillyjonk's hammock and lay looking at the stars through a hole in the ceiling. Outside all was silent. He could hear nothing except the nearest brook and the night wind. Suddenly the Hemulen felt anxious. He sat up, listening hard. Not a sound. "Perhaps they aren't having any fun at all," he thought worriedly. "Perhaps they're not able to have fun without shouting their heads off. Perhaps they've gone home." He took a leap up on Gaffsey's old chest of drawers and thrust his head out of a hole in the wall. No, they hadn't gone home. All the park was rustling and seething with a secret and happy life. He could hear a splash, a giggle, faint thuds and thumps, padding feet everywhere. They were enjoying themselves. "Tomorrow," thought the Hemulen, "tomorrow I'll tell them they may laugh and possibly even hum a little if they feel like it, but not more than that. Absolutely not." He climbed down and went back to his hammock. Very soon he was asleep and not worrying over anything. Outside the wall by the locked gate, the Hemulen's uncle was standing. He looked through the bars but saw very little. "Doesn't sound as if they're having much fun," he thought. "But then everyone has to make what he can out of life, and my poor relative always was a bit odd." He took the barrel organ home with him because he had always loved music. The end. Well, thank you, folks. That was the Hemulen that loved silence from the Tales from Moominvalley series. All right, I have one last little book, but it is a chapter book, so we're only going to be able to get a little chapter in. I've received some dire instructions. We got to wrap this up soon. I've had a wonderful time reading for you folks. I'm so glad you're able to show up and listen to this. But I got just a few more minutes, and I'm happy to present our last little story of the evening. And again, this is a chapter book, so remember, it's chapters. And so this is Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren. She's a Swedish author, and the story was first published in English in 1950. So we're going back a ways. There was a movie, I think 1969, I think it's the film version that was out there. It's a wild ride, so here we go. Chapter 1. That's wonderful, Terry. Chapter 1, Pippi moves into Villa Villacula. Way out at the end of a tiny little town was an old overgrown garden, and in the garden was an old house, and in the house lived Pippi Longstocking. She was 9 years old, and she lived there all alone. She had no mother and no father, and that was of course very nice, because there was no one to tell her to go to bed just when she was having the most fun, and no one who could make her take cod liver oil when she much preferred caramel candy. Once upon a time, Pippi had had a father of whom she was extremely fond. Naturally, she had had a mother too, but that was so long ago that Pippi didn't remember her at all. Her mother had died when Pippi was just a tiny baby, and lay in a cradle and howled so that nobody could go anywhere near her. Pippi was sure that her mother was now up in heaven, watching her little girl through a peephole in the sky. And Pippi often waved up at her and called, "Don't you worry about me. I'll always come out on top." Pippi had not forgotten her father. He was a sea captain who sailed on the great ocean, and Pippi had sailed with him in his ship until one day her father was blown overboard in a storm and disappeared. But Pippi was absolutely certain that he would come back. She would never believe that he had drowned. She was sure he had floated until he landed on an island inhabited by cannibals, and she thought he had become the king of all the cannibals and went around with a golden crown on his head all day long. "My papa is a cannibal king. It certainly isn't every child who has such a stylish papa," Pippi used to say with satisfaction. "And as soon as my papa has built himself a boat, he will come and get me, and I'll be a cannibal princess. Hi-ho! Won't that be exciting?" Her father had bought the old house in the garden many years ago. He thought he would live there with Pippi when he grew old and couldn't sail the seas any longer. And then this annoying thing had to happen, that he was blown into the ocean. And while Pippi was waiting for him to come back, she went straight home to Villa Villacula. That was the name of the house. It stood there ready and waiting for her. One lovely summer evening she said good-bye to all the sailors on her father's boat. They were all fond of Pippi, and she of them. "So long, boys," she said, and kissed each one on the forehead. "Don't you worry about me. I'll always come out on top." 2 things she took with her from the ship. A little monkey, whose name was Mr. Nilsson. He was a present from her father. And a big suitcase full of gold pieces. The sailors stood upon the deck and watched as long as they could see her. She walked straight ahead without looking back at all, with Mr. Nilsson on her shoulder and her suitcase in her hand. "A remarkable child," said one of the sailors, as Pippi disappeared in the distance. He was right. Pippi was indeed a remarkable child. The most remarkable remarkable thing about her was that she was so strong. She was so very strong that in the whole wide world there was not a single police officer as strong as she. Why, she could lift a whole horse if she wanted to. And she wanted to. She had a horse of her own that she had bought with one of her many gold pieces the day she came home to Villa Villacula. She had always longed for a horse, and now here he was, living on the porch. When Pippi wanted to drink her afternoon coffee there, she simply lifted him down into the garden. Beside Villa Villacula was another garden and another house. In that house lived a father and mother and 2 charming children, a boy and a girl. The boy's name was Tommy, and the girl's Annika. They were very good, well brought up, and obedient children. Tommy would never think of biting his nails, and he always did exactly what his mother told him to do. Annika never fussed when she didn't get her own way, and she always looked pretty in her little well-ironed cotton dresses. She took the greatest care not to get them dirty. Tommy and Annika played nicely with each other in their garden, but they had often wished for a playmate. While Pippi was still sailing on the ocean with her father, they often used to hang over the fence and say to each other, "Isn't it silly that nobody ever moves into that house? Somebody ought to live there, somebody with children." On that lovely summer evening when Pippi for the first time stepped over the threshold of Villa Villacula, Tommy and Annika were not at home. They had gone to visit their grandmother for a week, and so they had no idea that anybody had moved into the house next door. On the first day after they came home again, they stood by the gate looking out into the street, and even then they didn't know that there was actually a playmate so near. Just as they were standing there considering what they should do and wondering whether anything exciting was likely to happen, or whether it was going to be one of those dull days when they couldn't think of anything to play, just then the gate of Villa Villacula opened and a little girl stepped out. She was the most remarkable girl Tommy and Annika had ever seen. She was Miss Pippi Longstocking, out for her morning promenade. This is the way she looked. Her hair, the color of a carrot, was braided in 2 tight braids that stuck straight out. Her nose was the shape of a very small potato, and was dotted all over with freckles. It must be admitted that the mouth under this nose was a very wide one, with strong white teeth. Her dress was rather unusual. Pippi herself had made it. She had meant it to be blue, but there wasn't quite enough blue cloth, so Pippi had sewed little red pieces on it here and there. On her long, thin legs, she wore a pair of long stockings, one brown and the other black, and she had on a pair of black shoes that were exactly twice as long as her feet. These shoes her father had bought for her in South America, so that Pippi would have something to grow into, and she never wanted to wear any others. But the thing that made Tommy and Annika open their eyes widest of all was the monkey sitting on the strange girl's shoulder. It was a little monkey, dressed in blue pants, yellow jacket, and a white straw hat. Pippi walked along the street with one foot on the sidewalk and the other in the gutter. Tommy and Annika watched as long as they could see her. In a little while she came back, and now she was walking backward. That was because she didn't want to turn around to get home. When she reached Tommy and Annika's gate, she stopped. The children looked at each other in silence. At last, Tommy spoke. "Why did you walk backward?" "Why did I walk backward?" said Pippi. "Isn't this a free country? Can't a person walk any way she wants to? For that matter, let me tell you that in Egypt everybody walks that way, and nobody thinks it's the least bit strange." "How do you know?" asked Tommy. "You've never been in Egypt, have you?" "I've never been in Egypt? Indeed I have! That's one thing you can be sure of. I have been all over the world and seen many things stranger than people walking backward. I wonder what you would have said if I had come along walking on my hands, the way they do in farthest India." "Now you must be lying," said Tommy. Pippi thought a moment. "You're right," she said sadly. I am lying. It's wicked to lie, said Annika, who at last gathered up enough courage to speak. Yes, it's very wicked to lie, said Pippi, even more sadly. But I forget it now and then. And how can you expect a little child whose mother is an angel, and whose father is king of a cannibal island, and who herself has sailed on the ocean all her life, how can you expect her to tell the truth always? And for that matter, she continued, her whole freckled face lighting up, let me tell you that in the Congo there's not a single person who tells the truth. They lie all day long, begin at 7 in the morning, and keep on until sundown. So if I should happen to lie now and then, you must try to excuse me, and to remember that it is only because I stayed in the Congo a little too long. We can be friends anyway, can't we? Oh, sure, said Tommy, and realized suddenly that this was not going to be one of those dull days. By the way, why couldn't you come and have breakfast with me? Asked Pippi. Why not? Said Tommy. Come on, let's go. Oh, yes, let's, said Annika. But first I must introduce you to Mr. Nilsson, said Pippi, and the little monkey took off his cap and bowed politely. Then they all went through Villa Villacula's tumble-down garden gate, along the gravel path bordered with old moss-covered trees, really good climbing trees they seemed to be, up to the house and onto the porch. There stood the horse munching oats out of a soup bowl. Why do you have a horse on the porch? Asked Tommy. All horses he knew lived in stables. Well, said Pippi thoughtfully, he'd be in the way in the kitchen, and he doesn't like the parlor. Tommy and Annika patted the horse, and then went on into the house. It had a kitchen, a parlor, and a bedroom, but it certainly looked as if Pippi had forgotten to do her Friday cleaning that week. Tommy and Annika looked around cautiously, just in case the king of the Cannibal Isles might be sitting there in a corner somewhere. They had never seen a cannibal king in all their lives, but there was no father to be seen, nor any mother either. Annika said anxiously, Do you live here all alone? Of course not, said Pippi. Mr. Nilsson and the horse live here too. Yes, but I mean, don't you have any mother or father here? No, not the least tiny bit of one, said Pippi happily. But who tells you when to go to bed at night and things like that? Asked Annika. I tell myself, said Pippi. First, I tell myself in a nice, friendly way, and then if I don't mind, I tell myself again more sharply, and if I still don't mind, then I'm in for a spanking, see? Tommy and Annika didn't see at all, but they thought maybe it was a good way. Meanwhile, they had come out into the kitchen, and Pippi cried, Now we're going to make a pancake. Now there's going to be a pancake. Now we're going to fry a pancake. Then she took 3 eggs and threw them up into the air. One fell down on her head and broke, so that the yolk ran into her eyes, but the others she caught skillfully in a bowl where they smashed to pieces. I always did hear that egg yolk was good for the hair, said Pippi, wiping her eyes. You wait and see. Mine will soon begin to grow so fast it will crackle. As a matter of fact, in Brazil all the people go about with eggs in their hair, and there are no bald-headed people. Only once there was a man who was so foolish that he ate his eggs instead of rubbing them on his hair. He became completely bald, and when he showed himself on the streets, there was such a riot that the police were called out. While she was speaking, Pippi had neatly picked the eggshells out of the bowl with her fingers. Now she took a bath brush that hung on the wall and began to beat the pancake batter so hard that it splashed all over the walls. At last she poured what was left onto a griddle that stood on the stove. When the pancake was brown on one side, she tossed it halfway up to the ceiling so it turned right around in the air, and then she caught it on the griddle again. And when it was ready, she threw it straight across the kitchen, right onto a plate that stood on the table. Eat, she cried, eat before it gets cold. And Tommy and Annika ate and thought it a very good pancake. Afterward, Pippi invited them to step into the parlor. There was only one piece of furniture in there. It was a huge chest with many tiny drawers. Pippi opened the drawers and showed Tommy and Annika all the treasures she kept there. There were wonderful birds' eggs, strange shells and stones, pretty little boxes, lovely silver mirrors, pearl necklaces, and many other things that Pippi and her father had bought on their journeys around the world. Pippi gave each of her new playmates a little gift to remember her by. Tommy got a dagger with a shimmering mother-of-pearl handle, and Annika a little box with a cover decorated with pink shells. In the box there was a ring with a green stone. "Suppose you go home now," said Pippi, "so that you can come back tomorrow. Because if you don't go home, you can't come back, and that would be a shame." Tommy and Annika agreed that it would indeed. So they went home, past the horse, who had now eaten up all the oats, and out through the gate of Villa Villacula. Mr. Nilsson waved his hat at them as they left. And that's the end of Chapter 1 of Pippi Longstocking. And it has been a lovely night, and thank you all so much for coming by. I really appreciate you being here, and hope to do this again in the future, because there's certainly more chapters of Pippi Longstocking waiting for us to get through. Thank you. Yep, you all too. You have a wonderful evening, and hope you have an excellent week.